Hi everyone, this is part 2 of the Music Maker Deluxe, the making of. In this video, I'll explain to you how I made this using a discarded keybed and this empty Commodore case I had lying around. In the end of the video, there will be some more clips of this thing in action. As you might already know, the Commodore 64 is one of the best-selling home computer of all time. It uses the sound synthesis chip called the SID 6581 and the 8580. Saying that these little synthesizers on the chip sound great is an understatement. The first time I've heard sounds coming out of a Commodore 64, I felt like these chips needed to be taken seriously and should be used as a real instrument in an easy-to-use musical setup. I already had this empty Commodore case I've kept over the years. A couple of months ago, a friend of mine gave me this Arturia MiniBrute keybed he got from a local shop that was getting rid of some spare parts. The moment I've got this, I started messing around with the idea of making a Commodore 64 keyboard. At the time I did this project, I was not planning to make a making of video. Now that I am documenting all of this, I wish I had recorded some actual footage of the process. Anyhow, I will show you some pictures and talk you through the steps and the materials. Before we start, let me set the record straight. I love doing electronics and I acquired some soldering skills over time, but I'm still somewhat limited in what I can do. I also don't know how to program, so my keyboard needed to communicate with the host Commodore 64 computer in the easiest way possible, which is through the keyboard matrix connector. In that scenario, a note, for instance an E, is a simple key switch extension of its equivalent letter on the keyboard. In that case, the letter P on the Commodore 64. Most music programs use the same letters for the same notes. That way, they're compatible with the piano overlays like the Commodore Music Maker, the magical musical keyboard by Sight and Sound, and other third-party products. Since the host computer can't differentiate between me playing on the piano or its keyboard, every single old and obscure program compatible with the piano overlay would now be usable on a real keybed. First, I had to figure out the C64 keyboard matrix. I won't go into details on how they work. If you want to learn more about it, the 8-Bit Guy and Look Mom No Computer made very comprehensive videos about them. This is the C64 keyboard matrix. The goal is to find the combinations of pins that triggers letters. Earlier, we wanted to play the note E. The note E is the letter P on the keyboard. If you look at the green dot next to the letter P, you'll see that it's crossing line F and 1. On your right, you can see that F and 1 are the pins 11 and 15 on the keyboard matrix. Now that we understand the keyboard matrix, let's talk about the keyboard itself and how it communicates with this matrix. The keyboard I used is made to talk to the key mapping IC of, among others, the Arturia MiniBrute. I had to transform this keybed PCB so that each note would act as a switch, closing the connection between two pins on the whole C64 keyboard matrix. On this picture, you can see how the connections are made under the keys. For each note, there are two strips of conductive material on the PCB. I soldered a wire at the base of each of the black strips. In order to avoid unwanted contacts in my new circuit, I destroyed the original traces using a Dremel. The green silicone strip is placed on the top of the PCB. It has a plunger for each note. When a key is pressed, the two round conductive plates on the plunger bridge the two conductive strips and close the circuit. The PCB that connects all the individual keys is very basic. Each key is identified and goes to my 25-pin connector. For practical reasons, I couldn't solder everything from the keybed to the matrix pin inside the whole C64. That's why I started looking at my connectors options. The keyboard matrix is a 20-pin connector with pin 2 removed. It is completely up to you how you connect these pins to the connector that will make you able to trigger the keyboard keys externally. This is how my connector is laid out. The The paddles are connected at pin 21, 22, and 23. Please note that you can't use a salvaged Atari-style joystick connector because they don't have all the right connections internally. You need to make a custom one using a DB9 connector. Now, I'll explain how I designed the connectors in the whole C64 while managing to keep it unmodified. I designed a splitter for the keyboard matrix and another one for the LED. This way, you can connect both LEDs on the LED connector and both the music maker and the keyboard on the keyboard matrix. The strip of wires with the female connectors need to be small enough to pass through the user port opening. These wires then go to an external box that houses a 25-pin connector that go to the controller. On one side of the box, we have the connector that goes all the way around to the joystick port 2, allowing the host C64 to read the values of the two potentiometers on the controller. I made it easy to remove modification on my C64 in order to have an output jack. To keep the case intact, I use a composite port of the RF out. First, solder a thin wire to the audio out solder blob located under the PCB and run the wire through the PCB via the small hole located under the screw hole. From the other side of the PCB, route the wire to the RF output shielded box. You can use a nibbling tool, but the way the cover is made, it will pass through its crack. Then, desolder the metal pin that goes to the signal pin, the center pin, to the RF output. Leave it connected to nothing, but make sure it won't be touching anything around. Finally, solder a 1UF electrolytic capacitor positive side to your wire and solder its negative pin to the composite signal pin, the center pin. Your RF output is now an audio out. Note that you don't need a second wire going to the ground because the RF output outer ring is already grounded on the PCB. Now, the keyboard case part. Let me come clean. This is not a Commodore 64 case. It's a painted VIC-20 case. To cut the casing, you can use a Dremel with a rotating blade. Once the cutting was done, I filled the gaps left by the shape of the keyboard and the connectors at the back. To fill these gaps, I use a product called GB Weld Steel Stick. For the larger holes, I used the original plastic parts I had to cut out. I also added random pieces of plastic around the keybed. I found those around the house. For the finishing job, I used Tamiya putty. Again, search the internet for videos about how to use this product. One thing is sure, it is not made to be used as a filler because it shrinks quite a lot when it dries. It is mainly used to hide cracks and imperfections. At this point, the project needs to feel smooth and flawless to the touch. Remember this, spray paint won't fill out cracks or hide imperfection. If anything, it will make it look worse. So check carefully using your fingers and light reflections to verify that the sanding was done properly. Be patient. When you're satisfied with your job, you are now ready to apply paint. In order for the paint to stick on plastic, you need some sort of plastic adhesion promoter spray. I used the one from Duplicolor, but I found it to be very expensive for what it was. It's basically a mix of glue and alcohol formula that evaporates very quickly. 15 to 20 minutes after applying the adhesion promoter spray, you can start spray painting. Nowadays, thanks to retro-bright techniques, people don't paint C64s anymore. But when it was a thing, the color of choice was raw 1019 gray beige. Of course, this color was nowhere to be found in my area, so I used Krylon Fusion for plastic and satin khaki. Number is 42438. I think it's about to be discontinued though. Overall, I was pretty happy with the result. It's slightly yellower than the original bread bin color, But what is the original bread bin color anyway? After each coat of paint, I sanded the uneven surfaces, let it dry, and then resprayed. I repeated the process 6 to 7 times until I was satisfied with the result. Then I assembled the keybed in the casing. It needs to be properly aligned and rest at a significant height. Because everything needs to be fixed at some point, I couldn't just glue the keyboard in the keybed. It needed to be easily removable. For this, I used female standing screws. I glued them with epoxy inside the original keybed mounting holes. Once perfectly aligned in the casing, I used a Sharpie to circle around the standing screws. The final step is to drill holes in those circles and screw the keybed from underneath the Commodore casing. The main program I'll use with the keyboard allows you to connect paddles to the joystick port 2 of the Commodore 64 and assign them to different functions like filter cutoff, LFO mount, pitch bend, and pulse width. In that particular context, paddles are basically potentiometers. The proposed values for these potentiometers are different depending on the program you're using. For SynthCard 64, I found the best values to be around 300K linear. In order to have control over these potentiometers, I added 2 pots on the left side of the C64. I am aware that this kind of killed the original Commodore look, but my main goal here is to play music and be able to control my mod wheels with my left hand like on most synthesizers. The final step was to add the LED to the casing and attach this plain Commodore logo I ordered from the internet. So yeah, that's pretty much what you need to know about how I made this project. I did a similar modification on my Commodore C64C. Since I have no love for its looks, I didn't mind cutting a hole on its side. As you can see here, everything is directly soldered to the keyboard matrix, the port 2, and the 5V supply for the LED on the controller. I think I prefer the SID 6581 chip for its raw distorting sound and its out-of-this-world pulse width sounds, but sometimes when you need to apply filtering on a 3-note polyphonic chord, the 8580 chip is the one you want to go with. I am now leaving you with some videos of my friend improvising on some common C64 programs, but also some more obscure ones. 2 of them are compatible with a MIDI cartridge, but the rest of them needed to be played directly on the keybed or with one of these cheap plastic overlays I showed earlier. That was until now.